Hello, Dave Hurwitz at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about The Sea, Debussy's La Mer. Wonderful, beautiful, scintillating work, a classic of French Impressionism that sounds best when it isn't played impressionistically. Now, there are two textural issues that we need to address concerning most performances. One is the added cornet parts in the finale. That's the part where just before the final reprise of everything, you hear the trumpets go da-da, ba-da-da, da-da, da-da-da. They do that a couple times while the strings are playing a tremolo. It always did sound kind of like an empty area, and I'm not surprised that Debussy added something to give it additional melodic interest. However, most performances leave it out. Some put it in. Some, like Heiting's, had it played on the horns rather than the cornets. It doesn't make any difference. I mean, it's either there or it's not there, and quite frankly, it's not a deal breaker for me. It doesn't matter. Another interesting issue, also not a deal breaker, concerns the percussion. The score says that Debussy allows you to choose between the glockenspiel and the celeste. Now, this sounds very odd, doesn't it? Because the celeste is a keyboard instrument and the glockenspiel is a mallet instrument. Not necessarily. In Debussy's day, in French orchestras particularly, the glockenspiel was a keyboard instrument known as the claviatur glockenspiel. It was used actually most extensively in Messiaen's Turangalila Symphony, but it's also called for specifically in Mahler's Seventh Symphony. And he writes for it, you write for it like a regular keyboard, and Mahler writes two-hand glockenspiel parts in the Seventh, and then when he wants mallets, he says mallets. So you can have both. In Debussy's case, he would have expected that an orchestra would have a keyboard glockenspiel and a celeste on hand, one or the other. Probably in those days, this is 1905 when he was writing, it was more likely that they would have had the glockenspiel rather than the celeste, which was still a relatively new invention. But you can choose. My own personal preference is for the glockenspiel because I think the harder sonority cuts through the texture more effectively, and it's a very soloistic and exciting part. I think the other reason that Debussy, offered the celeste as an alternative, and it assumed, that it would be a keyboard instrument if it were a glockenspiel, is because the mallet writing is very advanced for its day. Nowadays, it's not a problem. We have mallet players who are so gifted that they can just whip the whole thing off on a regular a mallet glockenspiel, which is how they play the Mahler Seventh most of the time as well too, even though it's not technically correct. So those are two things to keep in mind, and especially in the second movement where the glockenspiel or celeste has a lot to do, you want to be able to hear it, and usually with a celeste you can't. You just can't. It gets lost in the general orchestral texture. So those are the two issues to keep in mind. I don't make a big deal of them. They're just things that I note in passing, and you may well want to listen to your recordings and see which ones you think are the most effective based on those instrumental choices. Now, I have quite the selection of recordings to talk about. I mean, everyone has done La Mer. There are a lot of very good ones out there. Forgive me if I don't mention yours, because it's impossible really to whittle it down to just a handful and leave all and put all the rest aside. It's just not possible. There are too many of them. But these are all interesting in one way or another and worth your consideration. First, we have to talk about the Wackiest Performance, and that's, as you probably might expect, Leopold Stokowski. This is his Decca Phase 4 recording, multi-mic'd to the hilt. And of course, Stokowski can't resist giving the music the treatment. Actually, what interests me the most about it is the very swift tempo for the basic tempo of the first movement, which is really beautiful and, very luscious with lots of harps and things, but at quite a clip. And the finale, the finale. At the final climax, Stokowski cuts the tempo in half and then has everybody land on that final trill when he lets the tam-tam player make a huge crescendo up to the end. Oh, it's all so wrong, but so much fun. It's just a guilty pleasure. It really is. But let's talk about sort of the normal performances that play more or less what Debussy wrote. First, we need to talk about Pierre Boulez. We've got to talk about him twice, but first was his earlier Philharmonia recording for Sony Classical. This got a lot of attention when it came out because of the excitement driving the finale to its final giant wave. I don't find this performance all that compelling, quite frankly. I think it's a little bit, it's not placid, obviously. It's quite eruptive, actually, and it's nicely detailed, but it strikes me as just a bit uncolorful, undercharacterized in a way. It's more like an abstraction than a portrait of the sea. But that's me. That's how it strikes me. And every time I hear it, I keep saying, well, gee, that's really exciting. I should be more excited than it's making me. But that's just the effect it has. On the other hand, in France, we have the Mer Orchestra with Igor Markevich, another conductor known for being extremely analytical. But here, he's in totally idiomatic hands with the Mer Orchestra. It's a great French orchestra playing in tip-top form, and it's definitely worth hearing for its textural transparency and for those wonderfully unique timbres that you only get when you have French orchestras of that period, the late 50s and early 60s. I mean, that was the last great flowering of French orchestral playing before it all went to hell, and French orchestras began sounding like everybody else, only slightly less so. Such a shame. Now here's a set that probably most of you haven't heard, and that's really worth considering also for its idiomatic flair. Emmanuel Rosenthal. Emmanuel Rosenthal, was the guy who arranged Gaieté Parisienne. He lived to be like 300. I mean, he died like yesterday. I don't know. He knew Debussy. I mean, he knew Rameau. I mean, he knew everybody. He lived forever. And his French music is every bit as idiomatic as Markevich's, and just as wonderfully done. These recordings they were on Ada. What is this? Ada, yeah, or Ades, or I can't even see it. Ades. Yeah, I mean, it was a small French label. I think they're owned by now a big label like Warner or Universal. Somebody will tell me, I'm sure. But if you can find these, they are definitely worth having because they capture the spirit and style of Debussy as he was intended to be heard, shall we say, authentically. I mean, not authentically the way Francois Xavier Roth plays authentically, that, so-and-so, but the real thing from a guy who knew the style and how to project it and to communicate that to his players. So, Emmanuel Rosenthal, Debussy, definitely worth a listen. Next, we come to a couple American guys. Reiner and Chicago. This is a great performance. And not just because I have word that they actually broke their tam-tam playing this climax in La Mer. That was the end of the one of the Chicago tam-tams anyway. They whacked it too hard, and you can't whack it hard enough as far as I'm concerned. At the end of this piece, a thrilling, transparent, virtuosic performance, as you might expect from Reiner and Chicago, in glorious living stereo sound. Also surprisingly good and surprisingly idiomatic was Zeller Cleveland. This is also contains some of Michael Tilson Thomas's Debussy, and I have to talk for a minute about Tilson Thomas before going back to Zell. Tilson Thomas is one of the great Debussy conductors of our age, and he also did a La Mer with the Philharmonia, which is totally thrilling. The only problem with it is that it was recorded in the early digital days in a very multi-mic'd fashion. So, if you want to hear a mic in the tam-tam, and, I'm not one to complain about that, but it's a bit much even for me, I have to say. I mean, the recording is very glary and artificial sounding in my view, but it's a great performance of La Mer. So it may not bother you as much as it bothers me. Anyway, back to Zeller Cleveland. I happen to think that La Mer, with its, microscopic patterns and textural subtleties, was the kind of piece that Zell kind of regarded as a challenge, and he sort of took it on as an I'll show him what I can do, exercise in orchestral virtuosity. And it's a great performance. It is completely uninhibited, but it's Zell, incredibly well disciplined at the same time. And one of the reasons it sounds so idiomatic, so French, is because Zell lets the trumpets ride the melodic line in those chorales, the brass chorales at the end of the first movement and in the finale, where nowadays you tend to hear this sort of big, fat, congested brass sound, very burnished, very low, and the tune is like somewhere buried in there. That's not the French sound. The French sound is to have a very, very unblended brass sonority. The authentic French sound is to let the trumpets ride the climaxes. And that's what Zeller does. And it sounds wonderful. It really does. It's a terrific performance, and it's definitely worth hearing. Now we go back to Boulez. This is one of the great La Mers. This is his second recording. It's also with Cleveland, and it's just great. It's absolutely great. It has all of that sharpness and clarity that you want with Boulez and that you also get from Cleveland, but also because it's late Boulez, there's a warmth to it. There's a comfort to the way that the music is played that's really, it smiles here and there, believe it or not. And I think that the performance itself is gripping just for that reason, because of that combination of clarity and geniality, that really, I think, makes this one of the great modern recordings of La Mer. The other great modern recording of La Mer is this one, this cycle of Debussy orchestral music with Stéphane Denev and the Royal Scottish National. This is a terrific Debussy cycle, and what I really like about it is just how unimpressionistic it is. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. What I mean is he gives the music muscle. It has energy, it has rhythm, it has fiber, and La Mer, it rises to these tremendous climaxes, and there's that fabulous lyrical tune in the middle of the second movement, da 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 da. It generates so much energy and intensity, and you want to hear it in a way where the conductor isn't afraid to let it happen. He's not just blurring everything together. These are performances that they're not the most disciplined. The orchestra plays somewhat raggedly at some points, but the interpretation is just completely free and uninhibited and exciting and really well recorded. And I think it's beautiful. I think it's wonderful to hear. It's very fresh and very exciting. But if we have to come to my one recommendation, here it is. Martinon, good old Jean Martinon. His Debussy was always extraordinary, and his La Mer, I think, has a character and a color and a tension and an organic blossoming of the motives one to the next that's almost unequaled. I really have loved this performance from the time I first heard it. It is, for me, what La Mer ought to sound like. And so with that in mind, that's a lot of La Mer, isn't it? And I'm sure you probably have your own. There's always more La Mer, but I think Martinon is the way to go on EMI if you're looking for one La Mer. And all of these show you just what an astonishingly original work it is, and how much interpretive latitude it offers the conductor, how much expression Debussy actually packed into it. And that's the wonderful thing about owning multiple recordings. It gives you an excellent excuse to keep on listening to La Mer. Thank you, and take care.